welcome to week 6 of the Enterprise Web Development module. So hopefully last week you got a chance maybe to catch up on some stuff if you needed to in terms of the lectures and the labs, and possibly got going on the assignment as well. So this week it's React. It's our last React lecture, I guess, and let's just see what's up for discussion. Just go over to the website. So it's React routing. I think I might have mentioned it anyway in the previous lecture, and really it's routing that makes a React app a proper app. Like up to now, our apps have just been a single view. There's been no navigation, but we bring navigation in today, and hence we have this impression that the app is made up of multiple pages, even though there's only one physical HTML page, but there will be multiple views. And really it's with routing that enables us to call a React app a single page app, in the sense that there is only a single web page, but there are multiple views available to us to navigate around. So it's really only at the end that we get to appreciate what the term single page app actually means and how it's realized. So I have two sets of slides, although there's very little in this second set of slides. I could have actually, the second set of slides has nothing to do with routing actually. It's an alternative way of defining React components. I could have actually covered this at the very beginning, but I decided to delay it as much as possible rather than complicating the whole basics of React. So we look at that at the end. You probably have actually seen, if you've done any kind of reading up on React on articles, you may have seen an alternative way of defining a React component. Rather than using a class, you can actually use a function. And so that's what I'll be covering in this second set of slides. The archive is fairly significant now this week because I'll be stepping through a whole series of samples, routing related samples. Okay, so let's start with the main slide set, which is this one here. I'm just going to check on Slack to make sure that everybody is okay, or that nobody is not okay. I'm going to switch over to here as well. Are you still having problems hearing me, Brian? You might just come back to me there. Oh, good. Good with me too. Okay, thanks for that. So back to here. Right, so the React router, it actually turns out it's a completely separate library from the core React. And for a while, the React router kind of programming model wasn't really fully aligned with the React programming model. It wasn't fully kind of component based. It didn't support the idea of component composition. It wasn't really fully declarative. It was kind of declarative in its style. But since React 4 version 4 came out, which admittedly now is about maybe 18 months ago, React version 4 has really tightened up on the whole kind of, or it has aligned itself with the whole kind of React philosophy, and we'll see that. But either way, it's still a separate library, which we haven't installed at all so far, but it's still just another npm install. And what it allows us to do, I'm saying here, is it allows us to have multiple views or flows. By flows I mean there, for example, if you think of when you're doing kind of online shopping and you've got a checkout, during the checkout there's typically a series of stages that you have to go through, and you're kind of moving from one view to another view as a sequence. We call that sequence of views a flow. So that's what I mean by that there. I don't think we actually implement any flows in any of the apps, the lab apps, but it's nothing other than a sequence of views anyway. And also, what's really critical is that as you are navigating around your app, you will notice that in the browser address bar, it's changing. So what the React router does is essentially it keeps the view in sync with the URL address, or vice versa, really, I suppose. Now, what's great about that is we get all of these aspects of our React app down here, and I'm calling these characteristics fundamental kind of principles of the web. This idea of addressability, we know from the very first generation of the web, which was just a static web, as we moved from static page to static page, each page had its own unique URL address, and of course that facilitated information sharing, because if I wanted you to see a particular page, I just gave you the URL and it took you straight to that page. We get that characteristic now with our React app as well. There may be a particular view within the app that I want to share with you. All I've got to do is give you the URL address of that, and it takes you straight to that view. You don't have to kind of go to the main view and then I have to explain to you how to get to the particular view that I want to share with you. This is kind of ignoring now the whole area of authentication, if that is involved, if you have to do some sort of login procedure. And addressability facilitates information sharing. Deep linking is also the same kind of idea. The fact that you can have links, hyperlinks to particular deeply nested views within the overall app. All I'm saying down here at the end is that the idea of apps running inside browsers has been around for quite a while, long before single page app frameworks came about. But the main disadvantage with the very first generation of browser based apps was that they didn't support these characteristics here. You did have multiple views, but the URL address just stayed constant. So they lacked all of these features, and hence made them not as user friendly, I suppose. So how do we implement routing or routing in a React app? So let's get straight into that, I guess. Supposing I have an app that has 3 URL addresses associated with it: the root, the address, this address, and this address. And what I'm saying here by this table is that if the browser URL is currently just showing the root path name, then I want my app to load the app component. If the URL is /about, then I want it to load or mount the app the about component, and if the URL is this, I want it to mount the inbox component. There doesn't have to be any association between the URL now and the component name. Okay, it just happens to be in this case. And for each of these components, each of these components might have a whole series of child components as well. So you could potentially be mounting and unmounting a hierarchy of components. Yeah. So how do I achieve that kind of routing logic in my code? And so the answer is you implement it in the form of a component. And here's a component, just like any other component before. The component name is not significant. I just give it a meaningful name, but it could be anything. And it has a render method, and it returns this little JSX structure. Yeah. Now the outer component has to be a browser router, and then the way we read this is, you could almost make sense of it, even though you haven't seen any of this stuff before. And what it's saying is that if the URL path is this, then mount the about component onto the DOM. If the URL path is this, mount that component. If the URL path is exactly this, mount that component. And then we've got the kind of default one, which is catching everything else really. So if the URL in the browser is none of the above, then it will automatically send you to the root path, which means it loads up the app component for me. Now the switch statement really there, or we're wrapping these inside a switch, and really, as I'm saying in the commentary here, we look at the sample in a second, as I'm saying in the notes here, the switch is a bit like a case switch statement. So really what kind of happens at runtime is the React router looks at the URL address, the contents of the URL address bar in the browser, and it just matches up the path exactly with one of these. And mounts the relevant component. Yeah. So let's look at sample 1, which is where the actual code is. Oh, sorry, before I move on to the code, this component here, which I've called router, okay, this is actually going to be the top component in my component hierarchy. That's the one that you provide to the React DOM.render method, because it contains the app's kind of higher level routing logic. Now, as we'll see later on, we can have some nested routing logic inside in some of our own components as well, but we'll come on to that in a moment. Also, before I move away from it, you can have a certain amount of wildcard characters in the path names here. So there is an element of regular expressions syntax supported by the paths that you specify up here. Okay, I don't do it in any of the samples, but it is possible. Okay, so really there's 3 new components that have been defined for us by the React router library. The browser router, which is always the outer one, these route components, which is how we define our routing logic, and the switch, I suppose. Let's look at sample 1. So what I've got here now, this is what you will download in the archive. This is just a Create React app. I've generated this with the Create React app. There's no storybook stuff going on here now today. And I've already started my developer server before the lecture. And the way you play around with this is you go into this particular page here, or this JavaScript file, which has only got 1 line of code, and you just change this to the particular sample that you want to look at any particular point in time, where these samples here correspond to these folder names here. Yeah? And inside in each of the folders I have an index and maybe some other JavaScript stuff as well. So let's look at sample 1. So I'm going to change this to sample 1, and the development server will retranspile for me as it's doing down here. And I suppose if I just look at the actual index.js, which contains all of my logic, just going to collapse that. This is what we've seen already, and I've just put the other components into this file just for convenience. You know, I should probably be splitting them out into individual files, but there's no need for these examples. Yeah, I'm exporting some of them because I just used them in some of the other samples. But other than that, they're pretty trivial components, all of them. And so if I go over to, in terms of the behavior, if I go over to my browser and it doesn't like something, let's go back. Yeah, keep doing that. Okay, so, and if I change manually, which isn't nice, but we'll have hyperlinks later on. If I change it to about, brings up the about page, and if I change it to inbox, which is the other, brings up that. Just going to bump this up for myself a little bit. Okay, so it's as simple as that really. As I'm navigating around, the different components that I want are being mounted based on what is currently in the URL address bar. And if I give it a URL that isn't mentioned, then the default one kicks in and it goes back to the home page. Yeah. So that's the 101, I guess. And here again are the components, and they are just outputting simple headers for me. Okay, so you need to declare a component which returns a browser router instance, and inside in that browser router instance is where you put the kind of high level routing logic programmed in a kind of declarative way. Next, if we want to have hyperlinks, now our hyperlinks need to be programmed using a special component rather than the standard anchor component, which comes with the HTML5. You can still use the standard HTML5 anchor component for your hyperlinks, but you're going to be missing out on some React router support, which you may need. Okay, so I guess the bottom line is, for any hyperlinks that are hyperlinks to something internal to your application, use this link component rather than the standard HTML5 anchor tag. And so that's going to, we'll look at sample 2 in a second, but this is what the homepage of sample 2 is going to look like. And here I've just got two standard navigation links. I haven't used any styling here now. Standard navigation links, and when I click on them, sorry, this is the implementation of the home page of this entire page here. I've condensed it into one component, and here it's just the implementation of my my navigation links using the React Router link component. And so it's a component, so technically I would say that t is a property of that component, and you set the t property to the particular URL that you want to associate with that hyperlink. Later on now we will see that you can sometimes set t to an object in which you give it some other information, but for now you're just setting it to the URL that you want to have associated with the hyperlink. And of course once we click on the link, once we click on our link, the URL address bar changes, and then the React router browser router component will determine what component should be mounted as a result of that, which we saw on the previous slide. Okay, so I am highlighting too that you should always use absolute URL addresses rather than relative, because relative one tends to kind of mess things up for you. So always use absolute paths. So sample 2, nothing too exciting really. So I'll go back and change this to sample 2. And let's look at the actual code in sample 2, all of the code. Again, we've got our kind of main routing logic inside in this component. I don't think there's anything new there as such. That's the component that we, as I said, that's the component that we provide to the React DOM.render. Here's the app component with its hyperlinks, and the other components, the about component and the inbox component, are the same as before, so I've just imported them from sample 1. And as I said, the behavior is, you know, as you'd expect. Okay, so any hyperlinks to some internal part of your app, use the link tag. If you've got a hyperlink to something outside of your app, then use the standard HTML5 anchor tag. That's hyperlinks, short and sweet, although we will come back to them. If it arises that you want to put a link around, you want to wrap the link around some other components, and in particular if the other components are associated with a third-party library that you might be using, what you might find is that the links won't actually work. So what I'm saying is that over here, like if my link was wrapping, if there were some other internal components inside here, which there aren't in this case, the links may just not work. And in that case, you should use the link container tag instead of the link tag. And it has the exact same props as link. Where I've particularly come across the problem is there is a third-party library called React Bootstrap, where you can have your buttons and etc. implemented as components rather than just pure CSS. And so if you had a Bootstrap React button, for example, and you wanted to hyperlink it, wrapping the button in the link tag wouldn't work. You had to use this instead. I don't think it'll arise, but if it does, that's your solution to why the link isn't working. Next is something called dynamic segments, which is poorly named. A better name is this idea of parameterized URLs, where you want part of the URL to be a parameter that can change. And so, for example, you might have URLs like this as part of your app. So the 22 presumably refers to maybe a kind of a user ID, and same over here, right? This URL looks like it's referring to all purchases made by user 12, and maybe the view associated with that URL would bring up all of the purchases made by user whose ID was 12. Yeah. So these are parameters within the URL. They can change, the values can change. And so the two questions that we have are, how do you actually tell the React router that a particular part of the URL is a parameter rather than a static piece of static string? And secondly then, presumably when you've got a parameter in a URL, the component that is mounted as a result of that URL being in the browser address bar, the component actually would probably want to be able to access that value and possibly do some sort of API call to a server side. So how does it actually grab that value? And we've got sample 3 to help us with that. So before we look at the code, I'm just setting the context here. So I'm saying, supposing, so when I've been using inbox here, it's in kind of the context of maybe an email app, okay, an app that you would use to look at your email content, email account, okay, so the inbox would be the inbox part of your email account. So supposing we wanted to be able to support URLs where we would have /inbox/ the ID of the user, and we wanted the app then to bring up that user's, the content of that user's email inbox. Yeah, that's what we want to achieve. So in terms of our route component, our path now is going to look like this, okay? And you've probably seen maybe some of this before in other contexts, but here, because I'm using a colon here in the URL path, that's telling the React router that this part of the URL is actually going to be a parameter. And I've chosen to give the parameter the name user ID arbitrarily. Okay, so really, the simple thing is that the colon is a significant character here in this URL path. So that's how we tell React where in our paths there is a parameter, and you can have more than one. Yeah. Second question then is, how does the actual component that is mounted for that URL path, how does it access the parameter? So here's my inbox component. In this case, sorry, just go back again. Yeah, so I still want the inbox component to be mounted. And so when we look at the inbox component, there's a lot going on here now, even though it's quite small. So the first thing I want to bring to your attention is this. So you get at the parameter via your props. So it turns out that the React router actually augments the props object with some extra routing or routing related information. And so to get at the user ID, this is the expression that I use. So there's a match object attached to the component's prop object, and that match object also has an inner object called params, and that params object has a property called, in this case, user ID. User ID here obviously comes from here, So it's quite long-winded, but that's how we access it. Now there's a little bit more going on here though. Ordinarily, this match prop is not available to a component. You have to do something extra in order to make that property available to your component. And the answer as to how we do that is down here. So you can see here that I'm not actually exporting, I'm not exporting my inbox component. I'm exporting whatever this function returns. This is a special function that's provided by the React router, and what you do is you give this function the name of your component, and what it returns is a new component, and the new component is effectively your component enriched with some extra props that it injects into your component, which is what I'm saying here. Okay, so it's a function, it's a standard function, but it's quite a special function. It's referred to as a higher order component function. A higher order component function is a function that takes a component and returns a component. And as I said, typically what it does is it enriches the component, your component, it enriches it with some extra stuff. In this case, some extra props, but you can enrich it with extra JSX and extra behavior as well, as it turns out. So yeah, it injects some extra props, and right now we can see that one of the props it injects is this match prop, which we can access. We'll look at the history one as well, which is going to be useful. Sorry. Yeah, and it returns, as I was saying, a new enriched component. So I suppose let's just look at sample 3, I think. Let's look at sample 3. And the code is, a lot of it is the same as before, really. The routing component is the same. Well, let's just look at the maybe it working. So this is my home page, and I've just sticking 2 hyperlinks. I've actually implemented these hyperlinks using the anchor tag. I could have used the link tag, but I think I used the actual anchor tag. But when I click the link, if you watch what's happening up here, when I click the link, the URL changes to this. So the inbox, the user ID is 1234, and 1234 is appearing here in my inbox. So it must be, when I look at the, we will look at the inbox implementation in a second, but well, sorry, we've already seen it on the slide. This is kind of confirming that my inbox component was actually able to access the user ID from the URL address. Yeah, and if I take the second one, you know, different user ID, and I've picked it up again here. So that's kind of confirming that I can actually access the parameter within my component. I don't do anything with it, just display it, but typically, as I said, you would use it probably to make some sort of API call to get some data. back to my code. Yeah, so I've implemented those links on the home page as just ordinary HTML links, but that's not significant. And in this case, the inbox component is new, and I've already shown you the inbox component. Right, so that's parameterized URLs, number one. How do you specify a parameterized URL? And it's got to do with using this colon syntax here. And number two, how do you access the parameters within your component? And it's with that match prop that's injected into your component, subject to you using the with router function, which is critical. Because if I simply, don't want to label the point now, but if I simply remove this and just export the inbox component, then you're going to get undefined turning up for this, because it won't have a prop called match. Okay. So as I said, dynamic segments is a bad name. Just really think of parameterized URLs. Next we have nested routes. So far we have only seen routes appearing in the very top component in our component hierarchy, what I named the router component. But it turns out you can put these routes inside in your own components as well. And yeah, so I'm giving you a scenario here, right? It's still staying with the same kind of context. So I'm saying, supposing we have this route as one of our main routes, but when the URL, the browser URL contains some sort of extension onto that route, so in this case I have two possible extensions. There might be a /statistics at the end of the URL, and when the URL is that /inbox/user ID /statistics, then I want both the inbox component to be mounted and another component of my own which I've called the stats component. Right. If there is no statistics at the end of the URL, then only the inbox should be mounted. Also, if I've got this kind of URL, I want my app to mount the inbox and a draft component. Maria draft emails are separate from just the ordinary inbox view. Okay, that's my objective. So the stats component notionally would maybe show some statistical information related to the particular user's email usage, Maria. The draft component might show some draft emails that the user has been writing up but hasn't actually sent off yet. Again, kind of Maria. Okay, so here's the inbox component in this case, and it's got ordinary rendering type stuff, but suddenly here now I've got some route components as part of the inbox JSX content. And so, when this entire component is rendered, now I've just added in a new messages component here, but there's nothing special in that. It's just returns a piece of static text really. But as the route components are saying, they're saying what I've kind of elaborated on a while ago. If the path is like this, then you should mount the stats component kind of at this position within the overall inbox component. And if the URL path is like this, then I want to mount the draft component at this particular position within the overall inbox component. I could have some other JSX stuff going on down here if I wanted to. So I can nest these route components anywhere within my my custom components render method. I don't actually need the divs there, I think, but they help to enclose it. It's a small point, but oh yeah, sorry. I don't have to use the same URL parameter there. I can use a separate one, but because that's really just only a variable name, I could have called this kind of just UID rather than user ID, and it would still kind of work fine for me. Do I want to look at the actual sample? Okay, okay, so we refer to these as nested routes. Let's look at sample 4 just to see the full picture, I guess. Close off some of those, and we're on to sample 4. Let's look at the code first, maybe. Index.js, again, same high top level router. That's okay, just some hyperlinks in the home page. And here is my inbox component. So we've seen this already. My message component, which I'm just using up here, that's just an ordinary component. I just refactored some of the stuff into a message component. And my stats component and my drafts component are pretty bland as well. Okay, and so looking at it in action, if I go back to the home page, and again now when I click on these links, keep an eye on what's happening. Keep an eye on what's happening up here in the address bar. So this one is just for inbox on its own. So that's what we had kind of previously. So there's no extra stuff coming being displayed down here. However, when I take this link, I've got statistics at the end now, and I've got an extra component being added on to the view, as well as the inbox component itself. And the same with this one. Okay. So it's a separate component that's generating this piece of text, and it only appears there based on whatever extension I have decided for my my inbox URL, if you like. Okay. So that's nested routes, nested with, and you can have any level of nesting that you want to. Now, alternative route API. So this route component provided by the React router, this is the way we've used it so far. So it takes two props, a path prop and a component prop. Now the problem with this way of using the route component is there's no way that I can actually pass some custom props to this component if I wanted to. Yeah, and so for that reason, the React router people gives us an alternative way of using this route component, which is this format here. So now again, I still have a path prop to my route, but it's kind of badly named, but the second prop now is render rather than component. And render, you pass it a function. Now that function can have any logic you want to inside in it, including probably setting up some extra props that you actually want to pass to the component that you want rendered. But the function, it can have any logic you want to in it, but it has to return the particular component that you want to have mounted when this particular URL path is active within your browser. Okay, so you've got some flexibility now in terms of how you want to set up the component that you want to have rendered. Here we have no flexibility. we're on to sample 5, and I couldn't come up with anything meaningful, so I'm just kind of passing kind of gobbledygook props to my inbox, I think, which we'll see in a second anyway. But either way, the idea is I want to pass some custom components, or I've decided I want to pass some custom components to the stats component in the kind of routing logic that I had on the previous slide. That's how I've decided to try and achieve this. And here's my stats component. Oh yeah, so here's my stats component, and it's actually this prop here, which I've given a useless name to, other. So I want to be able to set the other prop to a particular value, and I'm going to do that inside in the function before I actually return the stats prop. The other prop that I'm displaying on the screen is just the one that we know about already, the routing related prop. So this is the custom prop Maria that I want to be able to set up for my component. Okay, so it's sample 5, I think, is it? Sample 5, yeah. Let's see what's going on there. Quick look at the code. I think the inbox, or sorry, the index is still pretty standard. No change here, I think. Well, I've just gotten rid of the about because I don't need it anymore. So here's my basic inbox route, and in the actual inbox itself is where I'm using this alternative API for the route component. So here's my render property, and I'm using an arrow function. There's very little in the function, but you can have any amount of logic that you want to. Now, is there a little bit more going on here actually? Okay, so let's take it from here, right? So I've just declared bar here and I've assigned it a value, but presumably this would be something that you would compute maybe. And you can see down here that I'm passing the bar value as a prop, and I've named it other. I've spoken about that already. And in my stats prop then I'm accessing it, so that's okay. I've already explained that. The function that you pass to render, it takes an argument which we've called props. You see, what the route component will do is it will pass a props object to your function, and the props object that it passes to your function is essentially the props object that it would normally pass to the component if I was using, when we're using this style, okay, when we're using this style of the route component, the component that's being rendered is passed a props, and it is the route component that is responsible for kind of setting up that props for us. Now you may want the props object that's set up by the route component, you may want to make that available to your custom component here, as well as the kind of custom prop that you want to tag on. And that's really what I'm doing here. I'm taking the props object that's provided by the route component itself. I'm taking that and I'm using, you might remember from the previous lecture, the spread operator. I'm taking that props object, but it's really a parameter, and I'm spreading it out into its individual parts, and I'm making that available to the stats component as well as this additional prop. And if I didn't do that there, if I did not do that, then I could not have this. Okay. The match prop is provided through this expression here. a bit tricky now, but there you go. Tricky in the sense that from a syntax point of view, there's quite a lot going on there. There's the use of the spread operator. There's the fact that you need to understand that props here is the props object, as I said, that's created by the route component and made available to your component, which it does in this case here as well. And I'm actually just taking that props object and I'm spreading it out so that it's available to stats. I think I mentioned that in the slide. Do I? Sorry now. Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm mentioning it there, I think. I'm mentioning down here at the bottom. Okay, so I've already kind of elaborated on that. As always, you'll have to go back and kind of play around with these things yourself. Okay, there's also an alternative API kind of for the link component. I mentioned this at the very beginning actually. So far when we've used the link component, we've set its t property to a string, indicating that this is the URL that we want to have active when the user clicks on the link. But sometimes you may want to pass some extra information in the link to the particular component that's actually going to be rendered as a result of the user clicking on that link. So it's a bit like the previous this idea of having extra props in your component. Sometimes in a hyperlink where you're using the link component, not only do you want to specify what is the URL associated with the link, but there might be some extra data that you want to make available to the component that is rendered as a result of the user clicking on that link. So yeah, so it's passing additional props really, again, via the link component. So we're on to sample 6. And now, we've kind of seen this before, but now if we look at the actual coding of the inbox link here, it actually going to look like this. No. Okay, so here's my link component again, my t prop, but this time the t prop, I'm giving it an actual object. And the first part of the object is the path name that I want to have associated with that hyperlink. So that's same as before really. Here's the second part. Here's where you actually specify the additional data. So you have to have you have to name the second property of this object here as state, and you can set state to whatever you want it to be. So in my case, I'm setting state to an object where there are two properties in that object, alpha, beta, and set to a and something. So this is the extra data that I want to pass into the component that's going to be rendered when the user clicks on this link. And so the question is, how does the component, because again, we're making some assumptions now. When the URL is /inbox, then according to the top level routing in my application, the inbox component is going to be rendered or mounted on the DOM. And so we need to look inside the inbox component to see how does it get at this stuff here. And again, it's going to be made available to it as a prop. And is it here? Yeah, so here's how I'm doing it. Now again, just for variety, I'm using destructuring syntax here. So I'm taking my this.props, so it's this dot location property. Effectively, the dot location is where this state is going to be attached to. As you can see here, I'm going this.props.location.state. The state here refers to the state here. And so I'm taking that object, which is this object here, and I'm destructuring it, which I talked about last week. So I'm effectively declaring two local variables here called alpha and beta, and alpha is going to be assigned the value A, and beta is going to be assigned the string something. And then I'm just confirming it here by just displaying it on the screen for myself. So that's sample 5. Sample 6, I guess. Here's my hyperlink, and the A and the something is definitely seems that it's being picked up okay for me. Don't think there's anything additional in the code, but we'll just check anyway. Okay, so we've seen the inbox, and here are my kind of navigation links. This is the old. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay, the syntax here. Just be a little bit careful. You see, the outer curly brace is to support embedding variables in JSX. The second curly brace here is the object that I'm effectively providing to the link component itself. And equally then down here, you know, I need 2 curly braces to close off those. So that's passing additional data or passing additional state to a component within your link tag, and though that additional state or data is, as always, is made available to the component in the form of a prop, and the way you access it is to use the props.location.state expression. So we're getting through a lot here now, I appreciate, and you are obviously going to have to go back and review these things yourselves. Programmatic navigation. I'll take a break maybe after this one. So far, the way we've achieved navigation within our React app is through the link component. Effectively, hyperlinks is how we navigate around. But there may be occasions when you actually want to be able to program your navigation in JavaScript. Like, for example, maybe when the user clicks on a button that should trigger a URL address change in the browser, and hence something changes, the routing logic kicks in and makes the necessary mounting and unmounting. But it's initiated programmatically. When the user clicks the button, the event handler executes, and there is some code in the event handler which causes the URL, the browser's URL address bar to change. And because the URL address bar changes, then the React router logic kicks in. So how do we program it? There's 2 ways, declarative and imperative. Now you might think, well, obviously we go for the declarative approach. Not necessarily. Turns out that the imperative way of doing it is easier. But the difference between the two is if you go the declarative way, then you actually have to introduce a piece of state into your component, just specifically to support the programmatic navigation, and you use the redirect to React router component in addition. We've seen that already. We've seen the redirect component used in our main routing logic, mainly in the case of dealing with if the URL address is something that isn't supported, then there's a default component to mount as a result. But here we want to use redirect to go to program navigation ourselves. So that's one way. The second way is there's an actual history object attached to your props, and this history object has a method called push, which you just invoke, and it has the effect of changing the browser's URL address for us. So it's a kind of an imperative programmatic way. This history object is only attached to your component's props if you use the with router function, which we've already seen. So it's either or really, and I've provided implementations of both so that you can see them, compare and contrast them. Typically where you would one example where you would use programmatic navigation is supposing you have a registration button maybe in the top right hand corner of your app, and when the user clicks on that button it brings them to the registration form. They fill out the form and they click submit, and then when they click submit on the registration, the user is brought back to the home page, right? So the registration button is just a hyperlink, so that's going to be implemented using the link component that we've seen already. But when they fill out the registration form and click the submit button, it's when they click the submit button that's where our programmatic navigation might kick in and send them back to the home page. And that's kind of the context in which I'm using programmatic navigation here. So when the user clicks either one of these links, right, it brings them supposedly to a registration form. I didn't bother having any fields in this now, that's not important, but I do have a registration button in my form, and when the user clicks that button it brings them back to the home page. So it's the second arrow is where I'm going to implement programmatic navigation. And are we told it's sample 7? Just see it working first. I'm going to click on this link. So the URL, it's badly named now, but if the URL is register 1, here's my registration form, Maria, and the user would fill it out as usual, and then when they click register, brings them back to the home page, and the same behavior here for the imperative implementation of the same thing. The imperative is registration 2 URL, as again badly chosen, but yeah. So let's look at the code. So we look at the declarative one first. So here's my main router again, and the only paths that I'm interested in are register 1 and register 2, and here's my components that I want to have associated with them. So this is the component that displays the registration form with the button. This one does the exact same. Yeah, so let's look at the declarative one first. So here we are, and so here's the state that we have to introduce specifically to support this redirection. Okay, and I've just called the state property to home. Call it anything you want to, but yeah. And initially it's set to false. And here's the render method of the component. So it displays the registration form header. I've got my button with the click handler, and here is the event handler that supports the clicking of the submit button. And not surprisingly, I change my state, change it to true. Okay, so what's the effect of that? We know when set state is invoked, the render method is re-executed, and the first thing I do in my render method is I check to see is state.toHome equals true, and if it is, and here's where the declarative comes in. I'm declaratively stating what I want to happen if this condition is true. So I'm using my redirect component, and I'm redirecting to this URL, and of course this URL is matched in my router logic down here, and lo and behold, I get sent the app component is mounted, and the app component represents my home page. Yeah. So with declarative, you've got to introduce this piece of state, and you change the state, and in the render method then you examine that particular piece of state to control whether you need to redirect or not. The imperative approach, less coding, admittedly. So here's my component that implements my registration in an imperative way. Again, in the render method, it just renders the form. It has the button and has the click handler, and all the click handler does is it goes this.props.history, this special object that has a method called push, and you specify the URL that you want to essentially push onto the browser's address bar, and by pushing that URL onto the browser's address bar, the React router logic that we have below kicks in again, and we get the app component mounted. So it's much more straightforward from a coding point of view. Now critically though, as I've already mentioned, you see here I've called this component base register imperative, long-winded. But down here then I'm calling the with router, passing it that component, and whatever it returns, which is an enhanced component, which is named that's the component that I specify in my routing logic down here. Okay, if I specified the base registration imperative, then it's not going to work. Why is it not going to work? Because when eventually this gets to execute, there won't be a property called history available to me, and I'll just get an undefined turning up in my console of the browser. Yep, so that's programmatic navigation, two styles of it, and sometimes you use one, sometimes you use the other. And I suppose it's a question of style sometimes, but programmatic navigation. Okay, I'll just discuss this briefly and then I'll give you a break. What I'm kind of getting across here now is that if you look at browser-based apps, however they were developed, whether it was React or Angular or some other single-page app framework, it's become standard that the layout of your app's view kind of follows this style, in that typically there is a header part, and that header part remains constant. So as you're navigating around the app, the header always stays there, and typically the header just contains navigation links. Yeah. Similarly, there might be a footer which is constant. No matter where you are navigating around the app, the footer always stays there, and it may have some extra navigation links as well. There may also be a standard constant side menu with some other navigation links, and then it's the center part of the view that is constantly changing as you are navigating around the app. So just the structure of the interface tends to nearly always follow that, and I'm sure you've seen that yourselves. So there's kind of a permanent part, and then there's a dynamic part. Okay, there may be an additional kind of toolbar link, but that which can vary. This part might vary depending on where exactly in the app you are. But it's this idea of a dynamic part and a permanent part. And so how do we actually get this permanent part to remain constant as we navigate around the app? It's quite simple actually, as it turns out. But we'll come when we come back after the break, we'll pick up the story there and we look at the sample that does that for us. Okay, so let's break again for 5 roughly, and we'll pick up the story. Don't have any exercise for you. You could grab the archive resources, just download them, run npm install as usual, because it is a Create React app, and you'll have the samples then ready to look at after the lecture yourself. Okay, that's it for now. So see you in about 5 minutes. Okay, sound on and picture on. Right, so where we left off is how do we get these, as React called them, these permanent components or elements built into our app UI. So yeah, they're called persistent, not permanent, sorry, persistent elements or persistent components. And the use cases is, as I've already elaborated, for headers, footers, side menus that are always visible. And so in the samples, in my sample app, I have this header here, and I have with some hyperlinks, and I've got a footer as well, which also happens to have some hyperlinks, but there could be some text in there. So that's how they appear on the home page, but as I navigate around the app, so when I go into my inbox page, they remain constant. And it's actually quite easy to achieve them. It turns out that here's my main router component, which is again the component at the very top of your hierarchy, and it has the routes as normal. But if you notice here, I have a component which is a custom component, a component that I've written called header. Doesn't have to take any props, but it could. And I've also got a component called footer, custom component called footer. And so surprise, surprise, it's those components which I've nested inside my browser router. They are going to achieve this persistent aspect to my view. And so other than that, really, if I just look at it, sample 8, isn't it? Sample 8. Did I do it again? Oh no, okay. And yeah, here's my home page, my about page. These don't work actually. There's nothing on them. I just stuck them in there. My registration still works as before. Contact and so on and so forth. And there really is, in terms of the actual code, there's nothing beyond the main aspect that I've just shown you there on the slides. But just briefly, there's a lot of CSS styling. I've used Bootstrap. I think you can look at that later on yourselves. But yeah, here are my persistent elements, as I've mentioned. Now they have to appear. Well, sorry, yeah, they can be anywhere actually. Sorry, it's okay. And the header and footer components, nothing special going on there really. They're just ordinary components. Okay, there's a lot of CSS styling going on there using Bootstrap, as I said, but other than that. So that's how you achieve those kind of constant headers, footers, side menus in your React app. Now, this is going to be quite long now, this example. And the title is Protected Routes. By protected, we typically mean that the user has to be logged in before they can navigate to that route. Now, unfortunately, the React Router library does not provide anything, any support for protected routes. We actually have to implement them ourselves in a custom kind of way. And I did find quite a nice implementation online. I'll be honest, I didn't develop it myself, but I really liked it, and I'm making it available to you. A, so that you can see it working, and B, I suppose you could, if you want to, you can plug it into your assignment. Of course, it requires you to fully understand how it works, so that's kind of the challenge, I guess, from your side. You don't have to take this solution. You can, you may have found another one which you have tweaked and fully understand yourselves, or you may have grown your own solution to the authentication for the assignment, but here goes. So this is how it's going to look in the sample. So I've got in my header navigation, there's no styling going on here now, in my header navigation I've got just 3 navigation links, and based on the names, anybody can go to the home page, anybody can go to the public page, but if they try to go to the protected page, then when they click on, and also it's telling me the fact that there is nobody logged in at the moment, so we need to know how to achieve that. But when we click on the protected link, given that there isn't anybody logged in, it redirects us to a login page. Now again, a bit like my registration earlier on, I haven't bothered putting in a username, an actual form where the user can log in. That's not the focus of this exercise here, but there is a login button, and when the user clicks the login button, it's going to bring them to the actual page that they wanted to go to the view that they actually wanted to go to, the protected view, assuming the login is successful and all that. Yeah. Also notice now that the header now, the overall kind of permanent header has changed. It is recognized that the person has logged in, and is providing a sign out button when eventually they want to sign out. And so ultimately they will sign out, and when they click the sign out, it'll send them back to the home page, and they will no longer be able to go into the protected page, usual kind of stuff. So in terms of coding this now, there's quite a lot going on. So to try and hopefully help you to work your way through understanding it, what I've done is I've implemented a series of versions of this protected routes implementation, and each one is more functional than the previous version. So version 1 really has nothing working, but we'll step our way through it. But you definitely will need to, obviously you will need to review this probably a couple of times yourself before you fully understand the flow of how all of this works. I certainly needed 2 or 3 goes at it before I fully appreciated it. So anyway, it's sample 9, and you can see now as I walk my way through the different versions how you actually switch from one version to the next. So first of all, you're going to have to change this to refer to the sample. Actually no, I won't do that. I'll do it this way. So I need to, I'll leave the development server running, and I'll open up a second terminal. And if I just go back to the slides for a second, I'm explaining to you here how you actually switch from one version to another version. The assumption now though is that you don't make any changes as you're flicking through these versions. If you start making changes, then you're going to hit some issues with Git. So try and resist doing that initially anyway. So I'm just going to grab this for myself. No, sorry, get that out of the way. And do that again. So we'll start with version 1, would make sense. So when I hit return here now, it's actually going to change. Really, I've decided to put all of this code into one file so that I'm not flicking around files, but when I hit return here, it's going to change the contents of this file for me. Okay. Right. You can ignore this. This is what I expected. It's telling me that it's made some changes to my Git repository. So, what's how does it behave at this stage? Right, so this is version 1, which, as I said, has practically nothing working. The homepage link works, the public link works, and when I click protected here, actually, it's actually not going to recognize the URL at all, and it just sends me back to the homepage. But it's actually going to be worthwhile to look at the code, even though nothing is working, because there is one significant part to version 1. So anyway, take it from the top down. So here's my routing logic, and you can see I've got a /public /login and a base path, and I've got public component, log component, app component. I've got my hyperlinks. One of the hyperlinks here actually has /protected, which isn't one of my valid routes, which is why when I clicked that link, it effectively defaulted to this and redirected me back to the home page. My app component, nothing interesting. Public component, sorry, the protected component, which isn't being used at the moment. Public component, and my login. That's fine. Now, what is significant is this little object here. Now, obviously, in real life, when our app has some sort of login feature to it, then logging in would probably involve the app communicating with a backend API, where the app would send the API, maybe the person's username, password. It would confirm that they are valid and respond back to the app telling, yeah, this is a valid user. Right now, we don't have that here, so I've got a kind of a fake authentication service for myself, right, which is just running locally. Okay, so that's what the purpose of this old style JavaScript object is. So it has a property which is obviously going to change from true to false depending on whether somebody's logged in or not eventually when we get it working. It has an authenticate method where we pass it. Not, I suppose really we should be passing it a username and password here, but I'm not really interested in that part because our login form isn't going to have data entry. We're not interested in that, but I've just put it in here anyway. So the authenticate method it takes a username Maria, and it takes CB there stands for callback. Now that's going to be a function which we would pass to authenticate. And what the authenticate method does, surprise surprise, it actually sets my is authenticate property to true, so we're assuming everything is going to be fine, and it is going to invoke the callback function that has been passed to it. So what's going to be happening is my components, particularly my login component, is going to be passing a function to this method, and the method will call that function, and presumably that function may be changing some state in my app for me. We'll see that in a while. Now the only reason I am calling this callback function inside the set timeout is to kind of give the impression that there is some asynchronous behavior going on here. So we're kind of faking the fact that there is some asynchronous behavior, because in real life, as I said, the authentication would probably be done by backend servers, and there would be some delay between sending a request to the service and it coming back to us, right? So that's the authenticate method, and there's a sign out method which has a similar kind of flow to it, in the sense that eventually one of our components is going to be calling this sign out method, presumably when the user clicks the sign out button, and whichever component is handling that button in my app is going to pass a function to it, and it calls that function in a delayed way to give the impression of some asynchronicity in the app. Okay, so this is pretty critical now, even though we're not using it in version 1 at all. Okay, that's version 1. Let's move on to version 2. Sorry. So according to my slides, so version 1 is just a skeleton. Version 2, I'm going to implement a custom component called private route. Okay, a lot is going to revolve around that, but it is a custom component, and I'm going to have redirection to a skeleton login page. So what's going to be happening now is when I click the protected link, I am going to be redirected to a login page, even though the login page won't have any behavior. So at least I have that part of my protection route implemented. Okay, let's get version 2 up. So version 2. And how does it behave now? So again, public works as before, but now when I click protected, I'm taken to this login page. So how did I get that to work? Now in my routing logic, I've got a new entry here called private route, but this now is a component that I've implemented. And let's just quickly look up initially at some basic point about that. So here it is here, and the first thing we'll note is that this component returns a route component, and that is critical, because if it returns something other than a route component, then the React router would complain, because the only thing that we can have here are route components nested inside my switch. I can't have any other type of component listed here. Now, even though private component is one of my custom components, because it returns a route component, the React router library isn't going to complain. Okay, and the private route custom component, its API is very like an ordinary route, and that's purposeful. So again, like, we're giving it a path, but this is just an ordinary prop really, and we're giving it a component. And so the behavior that we want is when the URL becomes that, then I want to mount the protected component, which contains the sensitive data MARIA that can only be accessible when you're logged in. So let's look at what this component actually does. Now, so we are destructing the this.props here. Now, I've shown you already below that the props object has two parts to it. It has the path part and the component part right now. And I'm just destructing that for myself. And I'm taking out the component prop. And I'm effectively declaring a local variable here called component with a capital C. I could have called it anything at all, but that's a good name, because that variable is actually going to be referring to an actual component. And in this case, what would it be referring to? It will be referring to the component called protected, which is again another custom component, which you can see there. Okay, so anyway, this little trick here, again, I'm using the spread operator, so there's a lot of fancy coding going on here admittedly now, but what the effect of this is to declare a local variable called rest, and that local variable will be an object, and it will contain all of the properties of the prop object except the component one. Hence kind of the name says it's going to contain the rest of the prop properties, the rest of the properties in the prop object. That's what rest is going to be. Then we have our route, and we're actually using rest, and we're spreading out those properties again. Now, if you think about it, right, the prop object is actually, right now anyway, in the way I'm using it, the prop object, apart from component, it only has one other property called path. So I could have, so effectively when I take this rest object here and spread it out, the net effect of that is I'm going to be providing a path property to my route, which is this property here. I'm making that available to my route. So it was purposeful that I chose path and component here as the props for my private route, because they are the same prop names that are used for the browser router route component. Right, so here's my route, and the net effect of this is I would set the path property for it, plus other ones if they were there. The other ones might be, you know, the match property that the router provides, injects into it, the history property, the location property. Okay, so it's it has other benefits as well, programming it this way. And I'm using the render form of the route API. And what am I doing? Here's my function. And this, you might remember, is the ternary operator. I'm checking to see, is somebody logged in? Remember this ternary operator? This is effectively a bit like an if-else statement. Is somebody logged in? If they are, then return component. If they're not, then redirect, return a redirect, which will redirect them to the login. So I guess the overall purpose of this route is to either send the app to the particular component that the person wants to have mounted based on the URL, or else redirect them to this URL, which will have the net effect of sending them to the login page. Put another way, this is going to be active when there is somebody currently logged in, and so they can go to the protected page, because component here now, that is a variable which is declared up here, and based on the only use case that I have for my private route, it would be actually instantiated with this component. Right, so the overall effect of this is to implement redirection if somebody is not authenticated, or else actually have the protected page and the protected components mounted if there is somebody is currently logged in or authenticated. So a lot going on there. You will need to review that, I think. Now at the moment it's always going to be redirected because I have no way of logging in, so that's why back here, if I again go back to the public page, go into the protected page, it's always redirecting me to the login. Yeah, the URL is changing to /login, and according to my app's routing down here at the bottom, if the URL is /login, then mount the login component, and the login component just displays that. Okay, so I actually have redirection happening, but I still don't have re-login happening. That's version 2. Version 3, login is now supported, but it's going to be redirecting me back to the home page always. Okay, it's a bit better. And the protected page is now going to be accessible. Okay, let's see that. Every time I submit this command down here, you know, Git is actually changing the contents of this file for me. Version 3, let's see it working. Click on protected. Sorry, just go back again. Click on public. Click on protected. I get redirected to something slightly closer to a proper login page. Again, I'm sorry now for saying this, but obviously I should have a web form here where I enter username, password. But I have my login button, and when I click the login here now, my fake authentication service is going to be used, and okay, it's always going to accept the login for simplicity's sake. But when I click it, I am redirected back to the home page. But now though, if I click on this again, now I can get into the protected page because somebody has logged in. I can still navigate around, and always when I come back to the protected page, it will allow me. I can't log out now for the moment, so the only way of kind of logging out is if I refresh, which I'm going to do now. I just refresh the browser, go back to the home page, maybe refresh the browser. So I've reloaded the app, and now when I click on protected, I'm sent back to the login again. Let's look at the code. Okay, so nothing has changed here. Now what has changed is this component here, my login component, and this component is loaded when the URL is /login, and of course, sorry, now down here, initially this private route is going to redirect me to /login, which is where I get the login page. And here's the rendering of the login page. Okay, and I'm using declarative redirection being implemented here. So I've introduced state into my login component. It's an unusual name, but effectively this property here is going to be used to indicate whether somebody is logged in or not. Right? So it's local state within this component. You know, okay, it's also being, I have a property here that serves the same purpose, but remember now this is just a kind of a fake service. So in my app, the way my app knows whether somebody is logged in or not is really by means of this property here. I've just added in username as another part of my state, even though there's nowhere in my little sample app where I can enter a person's username, but that's typically where you would store the username of the currently logged in user. Anyway, what's important though is when the user clicks the login button, okay, it triggers this event handler here, and the event handler extracts this property from the state to find is there somebody logged in or not, and if there is somebody logged in, then it sends them back to the home page. Right. However, if that's false, it just displays the basic login page. So when I click the login button, this when I click the login button, this event handler executed, and I called my fake authentication service, and I called the authenticate method up at the top. That sets this to true. That's okay. And I also pass a callback to I pass a function. This is a function that I'm passing to the authentication service at the top. So this function here is actually executed by the authentication service at the top, but what it does is what's important, right? It calls set state, and it changes this local state property to true to indicate somebody has now just logged in. And of course, when you call set state, the render method is re-executed, and now when this if statement is evaluated, this whole expression evaluates to true because I have set it to true up here, which is why it now decides to redirect me back to the home page. Okay, I think I might have complicated a little bit that unnecessarily for you now. Just briefly go back over it again from when the user clicks this button, the net effect is that this event handler is executed. The button on click event handler is executed. We call our fake authentication service, this particular method. We pass it two arguments, the username, which I'm not really using, and a function, a callback function as I called it. So this callback function will be this guy here, which is executed asynchronously after 100 milliseconds. But what the callback function does is it changes this state value up here, sets it to true, and of course anytime set state is called, the render method is called, and now this expression here is going to be true, and we get the redirection back to the home page as we've seen. So now somebody is logged in. And we can kind of come back to this private route here. If I then just go back to the app again now, or to the browser, sorry. So I click that, okay. I'm in the home page and I can go to the public page, but anytime now I visit the protected page, I go straight into it. When I click this protected link here, it's effectively this route that handles it. Why is it this route? Because this route is really controlled from this entry here, and so it says if the URL is /protected, which we can see up here. Okay, so the URL matches. So So if the URL is /protected, then mount that component, and this route component is doing the same thing. Component now is going to be, that's just a variable which I've declared up here, but component is going to be bound to, that variable is going to be bound to the protected component, which is passed in as a prop into my private route component. It's getting complicated. Which is why anytime I click on the protected link after I've logged in, really it's this part of the private route component that's active. The redirection is no longer necessary. Why is it active? Because this expression here is now true. Fake authentication dot is authenticated equals to true is true, because when I logged in, I called the authentication service and I set it to be true. Version 3, version 4, the login now redirects me to the actual, so this is almost getting to the end result. It redirects me, rather than redirecting me to the home page, it redirects me to the actual page that the person wanted to view anyway. So we'll get version 4. Just want to check Slack now for a second, sorry. Okay, I think. Yep. Okay. Okay, so I've loaded version 4, and in terms of its behavior, public protected login brings me straight to the protected page. And the same would be if I had a number of different protected pages. You know, if I protected 1, protected 2, etc., whichever one I would have clicked on, once I had logged in, it would bring me to that particular page. And from a coding point of view, you know, you'd have one of these entries for every protected page. So what has changed now is that, okay, when I click login, I'm being redirected to the actual page that the person wanted to view. So how did we do that? Down here, yeah. So trying to remind myself now, where does this work? Oh yeah, okay. What's changed this time is this redirect to has changed. Previously it was redirecting me to the home page always, but now I've actually provided some additional information. We haven't seen this before now, but it's a bit like when we want to have additional props in our hyperlinks, same kind of idea here. So it turns out that with the redirect to component, you can set the top property to an actual URL string, or you can set it to an object, which is what I'm doing here. When it's an object, you've got to give it a path name in that object, and that contains the actual URL that you want to the app to be redirected to. And here I'm using state effectively to store the URL associated with the original link that the person clicked on, which is the /protected link. That's what this.props.location will contain the URL in the browser that was active when the user clicked the link, the protected link in my case. And we know that when the user clicked the protected link, the URL was /protected. Okay. So that's being stored here inside in the state property of this object, and this state property now is going to be available to my login component, because it's the login component that is going to be triggered as a result of this redirection to this path. Okay, and so when I go up to my login component, we'll see it digging into the state, the from property of the state property within the location property of its props, which is up here. Here this line here, I'm extracting this.props.location.state, and I'm extracting the from property from state. This extra bit over here, you see, sometimes the user might actually go to the login page directly. They might actually type in /login in the URL browser, and if they do that, then there is no kind of link that they clicked on to bring up the login page. They actually went into the login page directly. So that's what this kind of default piece of logic is doing here. If there is, because see, this now would be blank, this would be undefined. If the user did actually type in the URL directly into the browser, this expression would be undefined. And so undefined means false. So when that's false, it will the OR will actually pick up this value and assign this value to from. Well, in fact, it assigns this object here to from, to the from variable, local variable here, and it's not coincidental that that structure there is the exact same as this kind of structure here. Maybe I should say that this, if you did a console.log of this.props.location, it would be an object. It would actually have a couple of properties in it, but one of the properties in the location object would be a property called path name, which is why I'm doing that there. Okay, so the effect of this line of code is to extract the what was in the browser's URL when the user landed on the login page, when they were redirected to the login page. And in my redirect now, I'm redirecting them back to that, assuming that they have logged in there. They've logged in successfully. We've seen how the login worked, but when the login is now successful, I'm redirecting them to the actual page that they wanted to go to. Quite tricky again now, that logic there, to follow it. I mean, if you wanted to take the simple case in the case of the assignment, then redirecting somebody back to the home page would be the simpler solution, and then force the user to actually navigate to the protected page that they wanted to go to themselves manually. Obviously, doing it this way is a slightly better user experience, but more difficult to program. And again, this will work now for multiple protected routes. So I guess the advantage is if you can get your head around how this works, then it works for multiple protected routes. Finally, version 5 is where we support signing out. Nearly cut for time, not surprisingly. I'll try and Now when I click login, I'm brought straight to the page, but I've now got this sign out option up here. And when I click sign out, it sends me back to the home page, and now the protected page is protected again. I have to log in again, log in, navigate around. I can go back into the protected page as often as I want to because I'm still logged in. Signing out forces me to log in again. From a coding point of view, so from a coding point of view, what's actually changed now, the most significant part is this part up here. So I've written a separate component to control what should appear up here, and it's based on whether somebody is authenticated or not. If they are authenticated, then the component will just render this. Sorry, if they're not authenticated, they're not logged in, this is going to appear. If they are logged in, then this is going to appear. So it's an if-else statement, really. Yeah. And clicking the button is programmatic navigation. Yeah. So we have all the foundations looked at previously, but we bring them all together, and we have, if we look at the routing first, you can see here I have a persistent element. That's what this alt button is. It's a custom component which we'll look at in a second, but it's a persistent element. Yeah. Now what it renders changes, as I've said, depending on whether somebody is logged in or not. So let's look at that element, or that component. Here it is here. Simple component really just has a render method. Now it's using the history API, which is only available if the component is injected with the history prop. So here's the component, my custom component, but notice down here I'm passing the component to the WIT router, which you've seen before, and what it returns, that's the component that I've actually referenced down in my routing. Yeah. So anyway, what I do is I using the ES6 destructuring, I access the history prop, which is really an object, and I check. Well, you can see the logic yourself. I check to see, is there somebody logged in? Again, using the ternary JavaScript ternary operator. Is there somebody logged in? If that expression is true, then render this. Else render this. The interesting one is when it's true, there is somebody logged in. I have a button. Here's my button. Here's my on-click handler. Now, with the on-click handler, sometimes you can actually encode the on-click event handler like this, rather than taking this code and actually putting it as a separate kind of method and sticking it in here. You can actually embed it down there. Some people like it, some people don't. But what the event handler does is it calls my fake authenticate sign out method, passing it a callback method, and the callback method has the effect of changing the URL in the browser using imperative programmatic navigation. And that's why when we click the sign out button, it goes to the home page, because we know that URL is linked to the home page, or the app that generates the home page. Heavy going. This is how you step through the different versions. Eventually what you might want to do is just reset the entire Git repo, and this is how you do it. Okay, Git checkout master. So having played around with the different versions, don't go modifying the code though, otherwise make a copy of it and start playing around with it that way. But really, once you've moved through the different versions back and forth, and as I said, you probably have to do it a couple of times, then I would recommend that you submit Git checkout master at the very end. Frank will actually be doing Git with G next week, so those of you that haven't actually done any Git, maybe a little bit uncomfortable with this Git stuff, but just follow the commands that I've given you. That was actually my last slide. So I had some summaries, but if I go back to the website, I did want to cover a second set of slides. There's only about 4 or 5 in it. What I will do is, if I go back to here, what I'll do is I will make a short recording explaining this second set of slides. It's really, really quick, and I'll publish that. Try and do it tomorrow and publish it tomorrow as well. And then the lab is implementing. Sorry, if I just go back to the lab. Sorry, if I just go back to the lab. Or go into the lab. So the first section is implementing routing in my phone catalog. Second section is implementing routing in the Hacker News. The third section, I have to remind myself what's in the third section. Oh yeah, the third section is improving the app's re-rendering kind of policy. So this is a reference back to the should component update lifecycle method that I discussed with you 2 weeks ago, maybe two lectures ago. So you should be able to make sense of that part of the lab as well, even though it's got nothing to do with routing. I had to bring it in there. The last part of the lab concerns the second set of slides. So that way, the last part won't make sense until you see the video that I will make tomorrow. All a bit rushed as usual, but work your way through the samples, I think, really, and then the lab, and then you will need to apply them to the assignment, I guess. So thanks for staying with me, if you are still with me at 20 minutes past. And it's Frank is up next week, so it'll be all kind of server side from here on in. I will be back at some stage towards the back end of the semester, not looking at React though, probably looking at some agile automation process, maybe continuous integration or automated testing. Okay, so have fun with Frank, and I'll see you again at some later stage. Bye bye.